of after-dinner coffee. The three had the submarine's wardroom to themselves. The only officers aboard were either standing watch or asleep. 3 busy months, not counting yard time, McCafferty said, finishing off his milk. He was the first skipper for the new attack sub, the best of all possible worlds, a captain and a plank owner. Toland noted that Dan had not joined him and Morris for attitude adjustment at the base officers' club, during which they'd tossed down 3 stiff drinks apiece. It wasn't like the McCafferty of old. Perhaps he was unwilling to leave his sub, lest the dream of his career somehow end while he was away from her. Can't you tell from the pale, pasty look common to cave-dwellers and submariners? Morris joked. Not to mention the faint glow associated with nuclear reactor types. McCafferty grinned, and they waited for their fourth to arrive. He was a junior engineer, just about to come off reactor watch. Chicago's reactor wasn't operating. She was drawing electrical power from the dock. But regulations demanded a full reactor watch, whether the tea kettle was working or not. I tell you guys, I was a little pale 4 weeks ago. McCafferty turned serious, or about as serious as he ever got. How so, Bob Toland asked. Well, you know the kind of shit we do with these boats, right? If you mean inshore intelligence gathering, Dan, you ought to know that electronic intelligence stuff you collect comes to my office. Hell, I probably know the people who originate a lot of the data requests that generate your op orders. How's that for a revolting thought? Bob laughed. He fought the urge to look around too obviously. He'd never been aboard a nuclear submarine before. It was cold. Nuclear subs have nuclear-powered air conditioning, and the air was heavy with the smell of machine oil. Everything he could see sparkled both from being almost new and from the fact that McCafferty had undoubtedly made sure that his crew had gotten things looking especially good for his friends. So this was the billion-dollar machine that gathered all that ELINT data. Yeah, well, we were up in the Barents Sea, you know, northeast of the Kola Fjord, trailing a Russian sub, an Oscar, about, 10 miles back of her. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in the middle of a friggin' live-fire exercise. Missiles were flying all over the damn place. They wasted 3 old hulks and blasted hell out of a half-dozen target barges. Just the Oscar? Morris asked. Turned out there was a Papa and a Mike out there, too. That's one problem with us being so quiet in these babies. If they don't know we're there, we can find ourselves in the middle of some really unpleasant shit. Anyway, sonar starts screaming, "Transients, transients," from all the missile tubes being flooded. No way we could be sure they weren't getting ready to put some real torpedoes in the water. But we stuck up the ESM and picked up their periscope radars. Then I saw some of the things whipping over our heads. Damn, guys, for about 3 minutes there, it was just a little hairy, you know. McCafferty shook his head. Anyway, 2 hours after that, all 3 boats crack on 20 knots and head back to the bar. You're facing out and in live fire. How's that for a lively first deployment? You get the feeling that the Russians are doing anything out of the ordinary, Dan? Toland asked, suddenly interested. You didn't hear? Hear what? They've cut back their diesel sub-patrols up north quite a bit, too. I mean, normally they're pretty hard to hear, but mostly over the past 2 months, they just ain't there. I heard one. Just one. Wasn't like that the last time I was up north. There have been some satellite photos of them, a lot of diesel boats tied up alongside for some reason or another. In fact, their patrol activity up north is down across the board, with a lot of maintenance activity going on. The current guess is that they're changing their training cycle. This isn't the usual time of year for live firing. McCafferty laughed. Of course, it could be that they finally got tired of chipping and painting those old cans and decided to use them up. Best thing to do with a can anyway. Bubblehead, Morris snorted. Give me a reason you'd have a bunch of diesel boats out of service all at once, Toland said. He was wishing that he'd passed on the second and third rounds during happy hour. Something important was flashing lights inside his head, and the alcohol was slowing his thinking down. "Shit," McCafferty observed. "There isn't any." "So what are they doing with the diesel boats?" "I haven't seen the satellite photos, Bob, just heard about them. No special activity in the dry docks, though, so it can't be too major." The light bulb finally went off in Toland's head. "How hard is it to change batteries in a sub?" "It's a nasty, heavy job. I mean, you don't need special machinery or anything. We do it with Tiger teams, and it takes something like 3 or 4 weeks. Ivan's subs are designed with larger battery capacities than ours, and also for easier battery replacement. They're supposed to go through their batteries faster than Western subs, and they compensate for it by making replacement easier. Hard patches on the hull, things like that. So for them, it's probably an all-hands evolution." "What exactly are you getting at, Bob?" Toland related the story about the 4 Soviet colonels who had been shot and why. "Then I hear this story about how the supply of batteries in Russia has dried up. No batteries for cars or trucks. The car batteries I can understand, but the trucks... Hey, every truck in Russia is government-owned. They all have mobilization uses. Same sort of batteries, right?" "Yeah, they all use lead-acid batteries." "The factory burned down?" Commander Morris asked. "I know Ivan likes one big factory rather than a bunch of little ones." "It's working 3 shifts." McCafferty sat back, away from the table. "So, what uses batteries?" Morris asked rhetorically. "Submarines," McCafferty pronounced. "Tanks, armored vehicles, command cars, starter carts for planes. Lots of stuff painted green, you know." "Bob, what you're saying..." "Shit, what you're saying is that all of a sudden, Ivan has decided to increase his readiness across the board. Question. Do you know what the hell you're talking about?" "You can bet your ass on it, Danny. The bid on the 4 colonels crossed my desk. I eyeballed that report myself. It was received on one of our ferret satellites. Ivan doesn't know how sensitive those hitchhiker birds are, and he still sends a lot of stuff in the clear on surface microwave nets. We listen in to voice and telex transmissions all the time. You guys can forget you heard that, okay?" Toland got nods from the others. "The thing about the batteries I picked up by accident, but I confirmed it with a guy I know in the Pentagon. Now we have your story about increased live fire exercises, Dan. You just filled in a blank space. We have the beginnings of a picture. Just how important are new batteries for a diesel boat?" "Very important," the sub-skipper said. "Depends a lot on quality control and maintenance, but new ones can give you up to double the range and power of old ones. And that's obviously an important tactical factor." "Jesus, you know what this sounds like? Ivan's always ready to go to sea, and now it looks like he wants to be real ready," Morris observed. "But the papers all say that they're acting like born-again angels with this arms control stuff. Something does not compute, gentlemen. I have to get this to someone in the chain of command. I could drop this on a desk at Fort Meade, and it might never get anywhere," Toland said, remembering his section chief. "You will," McCafferty said after a moment's pause. "I have an appointment tomorrow morning with ComSubland. I think you're coming with me, Bob." The last member of the foursome arrived 10 minutes later. He was disappointed with the quality of the game. He thought his skipper was better than this. Toland spent 20 minutes reviewing his data in front of Vice Admiral Richard Pipes, Commander, Submarine Force, U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Pipes was the first black submariner to make 3-star rank. A man who had paid his dues with performance as he'd climbed up the ladder in what had traditionally been a whites-only profession. And he had the reputation of a tough, demanding boss. The Admiral listened without a word as he sipped coffee from a 3-starred mug. He'd been annoyed to have McCafferty's patrol report supplanted by a speech from a reservist. But that attitude had lasted only 3 minutes. Now the lines around his mouth deepened. Son, you violated a few security restrictions to give me some of that. I know that, sir, Toland said. Took balls to do that. And it's nice to see in a young officer, what with all the ones who just want to cover their ass. Pipes rose. I don't like what you just told me, son. Not one little bit. We got Ivan playing Santa Claus with all this diplomatic horseshit, and at the same time he's dialing his submarine force in. Could be a coincidence. Then again, it might not be. How about you and me go over to talk with Sinklant and his intelligence chief? Toland winced. What have I got myself into? Sir, I'm down here for a training rotation, not to... Looks to me like you got this intelligence crap down pretty pat, Commander. You believe what you just told me is true? Toland stiffened. Yes, sir. Then I'm giving you a chance to prove it. You afraid to stick your neck out? Or do you just offer opinions to relatives and friends? The Admiral asked harshly. Toland had heard that Pipes was a real hard case. The reservist rose to his feet. Let's do it, Admiral. Pipes picked up his phone and dialed in a 3-digit number, his direct line to Sinklant. Bill? Dick. I got a boy in my office I think you ought to talk to. Remember what we discussed last Thursday? We may have confirmation. A brief pause. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Aye, aye, sir. On the way. Pipes set the phone down. McCafferty, thank you for bringing this man in with you. We'll go over your patrol report this afternoon. Be here at 15:30. Toland, you come along with me. An hour later, Lieutenant Commander Robert M. Toland, USNRR, was informed that he had been placed on extended active duty by order of the Secretary of Defense. In fact, it was by order of Sinklant, but the forms would be correctly filled out in a week or so. At lunch that day in Flag Country of Building 1 of the complex, Sinklant called in all his type commanders. The 3-star admirals who controlled the aircraft, surface ships, submarines, and replenishment ships. The conversation was subdued and ceased entirely when the stewards came in to change the courses. They were all in their 50s, experienced, serious men who both made and implemented policy, preparing for something they hoped would never come. This hope continued, but by the time each had finished his second cup of coffee, it was decided that fleet training cycles would be increased, and a few surprise inspections would be made. Sinklant made an appointment with the Chief of Naval Operations for the following morning, and his Deputy Intelligence Chief boarded a commercial airliner for a quick trip to Pearl Harbor to meet with his opposite number in the Pacific. Toland was relieved of his post and transferred to Intentions, part of Sinklant's personal intelligence advisory staff. Chapter 6. The Watchers. Norfolk, Virginia. Intentions was a small second-floor office normally occupied by 4 officers. Shoehorning Toland in there was difficult, mainly because all the classified material had to be covered up while the civilian movers got the desk in place. When they finally left, Bob found he had just about enough space to get into and out of his swivel chair. The office door had a cipher lock with 5 rocker switches concealed in a steel container. Located in the northwest corner of Sinklant headquarters, the office's barred windows overlooked a highway and little else. The drab curtains were closed anyway. Inside, the walls might have been painted beige once, but the plaster had whitened from underneath to give the office the sort of pallor expected in a yellow fever ward. The senior officer was a Marine colonel named Chuck Lowe, who had watched the moving-in process with a silent resentment that Bob only understood when the man got to his feet. "I may never make it to the head now," Lowe grumped, sticking his cast around the corner of his desk. They shook hands. "What happened to the leg, Colonel?" "Mountain warfare school out in California, day after Christmas. Skiing on my own goddamn time. The docs say you should never break the tibia close to the bottom. Lowe explained with an ironic smile. And you never get used to the itching. Should have this thing off in another 3 or 4 weeks. Then I have to get used to running again. You know, I spent 3 years trying to break my ass out of Intel, then I finally get my goddamned regiment, and this happens. Welcome aboard, Toland. Why don't you grab us both a cup of coffee? There was a pot atop the farthest filing cabinet. The other 3 officers, Lowe explained, were giving a briefing. I saw the write-up you gave Sinklant. Interesting stuff. What do you think Ivan's up to? It looks like he's increasing readiness across the board, Colonel. In here, you can call me Chuck. Fine. I'm Bob. You do signal intelligence at NSA, right? You're one of the satellite specialists, I heard. Toland nodded. Ours and theirs. Mostly ours. I see photos from time to time, but mostly I do signals work. That's how we twigged to the report on the 4 colonels. There has also been a fair amount of operational maneuvering done, more than usual for this time of year. Ivan's been a little freer with how his tankers drive around, too, less concerned about running a battalion across a plowed field, for example. And you're supposed to have a look at anything that's unusual, no matter how dumb it seems, right? That gives you a pretty wide brief, doesn't it? We got something interesting along those lines from DIA. Have a look at these. Lowe pulled a pair of 8x10 photographs from a manila envelope and handed them to Toland. They seemed to show the same parcel of land, but from slightly different angles and different times of year. In the upper left corner was a pair of isbas, the crude huts of Russian peasant life. Toland looked up. Collective farm? Yeah, number 1196. A little one about 200 clicks northwest of Moscow. Tell me what's different between the two. Toland looked back at the photos. In one was a straight line of fenced gardens, perhaps an acre each. In the other, he could see a new fence for 4 of the patches, and one patch whose fenced area had been roughly doubled. A colonel, army type, I used to work with sent me these. Thought I'd find it amusing. I grew up on a corn farm in Iowa, you see. So, Ivan's increasing the private patches for the farmers to work on their own, eh? Looks that way. Hasn't been announced, has it? I haven't read anything about it. Toland didn't read the government's secret in-house publication, National Intelligence Digest, but the NSA cafeteria gossip usually covered harmless stuff like this. Intelligence types talked shop as much as any others. Lowe shook his head slightly. Nope, and that's a little odd. It's something they should announce. The papers would call that another sure sign of the liberalization trend we've been seeing. Just this one farm, maybe? As a matter of fact, they've seen the same thing at 5 other places. But we don't generally use our recon sats for this sort of thing. They got this on a slow news day, I suppose. The important stuff must have been covered by clouds. Toland nodded agreement. The reconnaissance satellites were used to evaluate Soviet grain crops, but that happened later in the year. The Russians knew it also, since it had been in the open press for over a decade, explaining why there was a team of agronomists in the U.S. Department of Agriculture with special intelligence compartmented security clearance. Kind of late in the season to do that, isn't it? I mean, will it do any good to give them this land this time of year? I got these a week ago. I think they're a little older than that. This is about the time most of their farms start planting. It stays cold there quite a long time, remember? But the high latitudes make up for it with longer summer days. Assume that this is a nationwide move on their part. Evaluate that for me, Bob. The colonel's eyes narrowed briefly. Smart move on their part, obviously. It could solve a lot of their food supply problems, particularly for truck farm stuff, I guess. Tomatoes, onions, that sort of thing. Maybe. You might also note that this sort of farming is manpower intensive, but not machinery intensive. What about the demographic aspect of the move? Toland blinked. There was a tendency in the U.S. Navy to assume that since they made their living by charging into machine gun fire, Marines were dumb. Most of the Kokolzniki are relatively old folks. The median age is in the late 40s, early 50s. So most of the private plots are managed by the older people, while the mechanized work, like driving the combines and trucks, which pays a hell of a lot better, is done by the younger workers. You're telling me that this way they can increase some food production without the younger men of military service age. One way to look at it, Lowe said. Politically, it's dynamite. You can't take away things people already have. Back in the early 60s, a rumor, wasn't even true, got started to the effect that Khrushchev was going to reduce or eliminate the private plots those poor bastards get. There was hell to pay. I was in the language school at Monterey then, and I remember the Russian papers that came through the language school. They spent weeks denying the story. Those private plots are the most productive sector of their agricultural system. Less than 2% of their arable land, it produces about half of their fruit and potatoes, more than a third of their eggs, vegetables, and meat. Hell, it's the only part of the damned agricultural system that works. The big shots over there have known for years that by doing this, they could solve their food shortage problems, and still they haven't done it for political reasons. They couldn't run the risk of state sponsorship for a whole new generation of kulaks. Until now. But it appears they've done it without making a formal announcement. And it just so happens that they are increasing their military readiness at the same time. I never believe in coincidences, even when I'm a dumb line officer running across a beach. Lowe's uniform blouse hung in the corner. Toland sipped at his coffee and surveyed its 4 rows of decorations. There were 3 repeat pips on his Vietnam service ribbon, and a Navy cross. Dressed in the olive green sweater affected by Marine officers, Lowe was not a big man, and his Midwest accent gave evidence of a relaxed, almost bored outlook on life. But his brown eyes said something else entirely. Colonel Lowe was thinking along Toland's lines already, and he was not the least happy about it. Chuck, if they are really preparing for some action on a large scale, they just can't mess with a few colonels. Something else will start showing up. They'll have to do some work at the bottom, too. Yeah, that's the next thing we have to look for. I sent a request into DIA yesterday. From now on, when Red Star comes out, the attaché in Moscow will send a photo facsimile to us via satellite. If they start doing that, it'll sure as hell turn up in Krasnaya Zvezda. Bob, I think you've opened a very interesting can of worms, and you're not going to be alone examining it. Toland finished his coffee. The Soviets had taken an entire class of fleet ballistic missile submarines out of service. They were conducting arms talks in Vienna. They were buying grain from America and Canada under surprisingly favorable terms, even allowing American hulls to handle 20% of the cargo. How did this jibe with the signs he had seen? Logically, it didn't, except in one specific case. That wasn't possible. Was it? Shpola, the Ukraine. The crashing sound of the 125mm tank gun was enough to strip the hair off your head, Alexeyev thought. But after 5 hours of running this exercise, it came through his ear protectors as a dull ringing sound. This morning, the ground had been covered with grass and dotted with new saplings. But now it was a uniform wasteland of mud, marked only with the tread marks of T-80 main battle tanks and BMP armored infantry fighting vehicles. 3 times the regiment had run this exercise, simulating a frontal assault of tanks and mounted infantry against an enemy of equal strength. 90 mobile guns had supplied fire support, along with a battery of rocket launchers. 3 times. Alexeyev turned, removing his helmet and earmuffs to look at the regimental commander. A Guards regiment, eh, Comrade Colonel? Elite soldiers of the Red Army. These tit-sucking children couldn't guard a Turkish whorehouse, much less do anything worthwhile inside of it. And what have you been doing for the past 4 years commanding this rolling circus, Comrade Colonel? You have learned to kill your whole command 3 times. Your artillery observers are not located properly. Your tanks and infantry carriers still can't coordinate their movements, and your tank gunners can't find targets 3 meters high. If that had been a NATO force holding that ridge, you and your command would be dead. Alexeyev examined the colonel's face. His demeanor was changing from red fear to white anger. Good. The loss of these people is no great penalty for the state, but that is valuable equipment. Burning valuable fuel, shooting valuable ordnance, and taking up my valuable time. Comrade Colonel, I must leave you now. First, I will throw up. Then I will fly to my command post. I will be back. When I come back, we will run this exercise again. Your men will perform properly, Comrade Colonel, or you will spend the rest of your miserable life counting trees. Alexeyev stomped off, not even acknowledging the colonel's salute. His adjutant, a full colonel of tank troops, held open the door and got in behind his boss. Shaping up rather well, eh? Alexeyev asked. Not well enough, but there has been progress, the colonel allowed. They have only another 6 weeks before they have to start moving west. It was the wrong thing to say. Alexeyev had spent 2 weeks chivying this division toward combat readiness, only to learn the day before that it had been allocated to Germany instead of toward his own as yet incomplete plan to descend into Iraq and Iran. Already 4 divisions, all of his elite Guards tank units, had been taken away, and each change in Sink Southwest's order of battle forced him to restructure his own plan for the Gulf. An endless circle. He was being forced to select less ready units, forcing Alexeyev to devote more time to unit training and less time to the plan that had to be completed in another 2 weeks. Those men are going to have a very busy 6 weeks. What about the commander? The colonel asked. Alexeyev shrugged. He's been in this job too long. 45 is too old for this kind of command. And he reads his fucking parade manuals too much instead of going out in the field. But a good man. Too good to be sent counting trees. Alexeyev chuckled heavily. It was a Russian saying that dated back to the Tsars. People exiled to Siberia were said to have nothing to do but count trees. Another of the things Lenin had changed. Now people in the Gulag had plenty to do. The last 2 times they did well enough to succeed, I think. This regiment will be ready, along with the whole division. USS Faris. Bridge, sonar. We have a contact bearing 094, announced a voice on the bulkhead-mounted speaker. Commander Morris turned in his elevated swivel chair to watch his officer of the deck respond. The OOD trained his binoculars to the direction of the contact. There was nothing there. Bearing is clear. Morris got up from his chair. Set condition 1AS. Aye, aye, battle stations. The OOD acknowledged the order. The bosun's mate of the watch walked to the announcing system and blew a 3-note whistle on his bosun's pipe into the speaker. General quarters, general quarters. All hands man your battle stations for anti-submarine warfare. The alarm gong came next, and a quiet forenoon watch ended. Morris went aft, down the ladder to the Combat Information Center, or CIC. His executive officer would take the con at the bridge, allowing the captain to control the ship's weapons and sensors from her tactical nerve center. All over the ship, men were running to stations. Watertight doors and hatches were dropped into place and dogged down to give the ship full watertight integrity. Damage control parties donned emergency equipment. It took just over 4 minutes. Getting better, Morris noted, as the manned and ready calls were relayed to him by the CIC talker. Since leaving Norfolk 4 days before, Ferris was averaging 3 GQ calls per day, as ordered by Commander, Naval Surface Forces Atlantic. No one had confirmed it, but Morris figured that his friend's information had kicked over an anthill. His training routines had been doubled, and the orders for the increase of activity were classified as high as anything he had ever seen. More remarkably, the increased training tempos would interfere with maintenance scheduling, something not lightly set aside. "All stations report manned and ready," the talker finally announced. "Condition Zebra set throughout the ship." "Very well," the tactical action officer acknowledged. "Report, mister," Morris ordered. "Sir, the navigation and air search radars are in standby and the sonar is in passive mode," replied the TAO. "Contact looks like a snorkeling submarine. Came in clear all at once. We've got a target motion analysis track going. His bearing is changing fore to aft and pretty fast, too. A little soon to be sure, but it's shaping up like he's on a reciprocal heading, probably no more than 10 miles out." "Contact report off to Norfolk yet?" "Waiting for your say-so." "Very well. Let's see how well we can run a hold-down exercise, mister." Within 15 minutes, Ferris's helicopter was dropping sonobuoys on the submarine, and the frigate was lashing it with her powerful active sonar. They wouldn't stop until the Soviet submarine admitted defeat by coming back to snorkeling depth, or until he evaded the frigate, which would put a large black mark in Morris's copybook. The objective of this non-lethal exercise was nasty enough: to break the submarine captain's confidence in his vessel, his crew, and himself. USS Chicago. They were 1,000 miles offshore, heading northeast at 25 knots. The crew was decidedly unhappy, though they'd all been through this before. What should have been a 3-week layover at Norfolk had been cut short at 8 days, a bitter pill after a long first cruise. Trips and vacations had been interrupted, and some minor maintenance work supposed to have been done by shoreside technicians was now being done round the clock by her own crew. McCafferty had announced his sealed orders to the crew 2 hours after diving. Conduct 2 weeks of intensive tracking and torpedo drills, then proceed to the Barents Sea for further intelligence gathering. It was important, he told them. They'd heard that one before, too. Chapter 7. Initial Observations. Norfolk, Virginia. Toland hoped his uniform was properly arranged. It was 06:30 on a Wednesday morning, and he'd been up since 4 rehearsing his presentation, and cursing Sinklant for an early riser who probably wanted to get in a round of golf that afternoon. He would spend the afternoon, as he had for several weeks, sifting through endless intel documents and copies of Soviet publications in the Intentions cubbyhole half a building away. The flag officer's briefing room seemed a different world from the rest of the tawdry building, but that was hardly a surprise. Admirals liked their comforts. Bob made a quick trip to the nearby head to eliminate a distraction caused by too much wake-up coffee. By the time he came back, the flag officers were filing in. They exchanged greetings, but there were no jokes. None of the banter one would expect this early in the morning. The officers selected their leather seats by order of rank. Those few who smoked had ashtrays. Each had a notepad. Stewards brought in several pots of coffee, cream, and sugar on silver trays, then withdrew. The cups were already in place. Each officer poured himself a cup as part of the morning ritual. Sinklant nodded to Toland. "Good morning, gentlemen. Approximately a month ago, 4 colonels in the Soviet Army, all regimental commanders in mechanized divisions, were court-martialed and executed for falsifying data on their unit training and readiness reports," Toland began, explaining the significance of this. Earlier this week, Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, the daily newspaper of the entire Soviet military, publicized the execution of a number of privates in the Soviet Army. All but 2 were in the final 6 months of their enlistment period, and all were charged with disobeying the orders of their sergeants. Why is this significant? The Russian army has long been known for its tough discipline. But as with many aspects of the Soviet Union, not everything is as it seems. A sergeant in the Soviet Army is not a professional soldier, as is the case in most armies. He is a conscript, just like the privates, selected early in his enlistment term for special training due to his intelligence, political reliability, or perceived leadership ability. He is sent to a tough 6-month course to make him an instant sergeant, then returned to his operational unit. In fact, he has about as little practical experience as his subordinates, and his superior knowledge of tactics and weapons use is a matter of increments rather than the more dramatic differences between sergeants and new recruits in Western forces. Because of this, the real pecking order in Soviet ground formations does not necessarily derive from rank, but from time in service. The Soviets induct their troops twice a year, in December and June. With the usual 2-year term of service, we see that there are 4 classes in any formation. The lowest class is in its first 6-month period, and the highest is in its 4th. The young men who have the actual status in a Soviet rifle company are those in their final 6-month term. They typically demand and get the best, or at least the most, food, uniforms, and work details. And they typically obviate the authority of the company NCOs. In fact, orders come directly from the officers, not the platoon and squad sergeants, and are usually carried out with little regard to what we consider conventional military discipline at the sub-officer level. As you can imagine, this places an enormous strain on the junior officers, and in many ways forces the officers to live with some things that they clearly do not and cannot like. "You're saying that their military formations operate under the principle of organized anarchy," observed the commander of Strike Fleet Atlantic. "Their Navy sure as hell doesn't." "That is true, sir. As we know, their seamen are in for 3 years instead of 2, and their situation, while similar, has many differences from that of the Soviet Army. And it would seem that this situation is ending in the Soviet Army as well. That subunit discipline is being quickly and vigorously reestablished." "Just how many privates got themselves popped?" asked the general commanding 2nd Marine Division. 11, sir, listed by name and unit. That information is in your handout. Most were in their 4th class, meaning the last 6 months of their enlistment period. "Did the article you read make general conclusions?" Sinklant asked. "No, Admiral. There is an unwritten rule in Soviet publications, both military and civilian, that you can criticize but not generalize. What that means is that individual screw-ups can be identified and castigated at length. But for political reasons, it is unacceptable to make general criticisms applying to a whole institution. You see, a critique that pointed to an all-pervasive condition would ipso facto critique Soviet society as a whole, and thereby the Communist Party, which oversees every aspect of Soviet life. It is a thin, but to them a philosophically important distinction. In fact, when individual malefactors are named, the system as a whole is being criticized, but in a politically acceptable way. This article is a signal to every officer, NCO, and private soldier in the Soviet military. The times, they are a-changin'. The question we've been asking over in intentions is, why? It would appear that this is not an isolated case of changing times. Toland flipped on an overhead projector and set a view graph in place. Within the Soviet Navy, surface-to-surface missile live fires are up 70% from last year. Not quite an all-time high, but, as you can see from this graph, pretty close to it. Submarine deployments, mainly those for diesel subs, are down. And intelligence reports tell us that an unusually high number of submarines are in the yards for what appears to be routine but unscheduled maintenance. We have reason to believe that this situation is connected with a nationwide shortage of lead-acid batteries. It appears likely that all Soviet submarines are undergoing battery replacement, and that regular battery production is being redirected to militarily important segments of the Soviet economy. We have also noted higher levels of activity by Soviet naval surface forces, naval aviation units, and other long-range aircraft formations, again with increased weapons exercises. Finally, there has been an increase in the time away from port days of Soviet surface combatants. Although this number represents a small increase, operational patterns are different from what we've become accustomed to. Instead of sailing from one point to another and just dropping the hook, their surface combatants appear to be running more realistic exercises. They've done this before, but never without announcing it. So what we are seeing in the Soviet Navy is an extensive stand-down accompanied by increasing tempos in the actual exercises that are being run. Matched with what we're seeing in the Soviet Army and Air Force, it appears that their military readiness is being increased across the board. At the same time that they are proposing reductions in strategic nuclear weapons, their conventional forces are rapidly improving their ability to engage in combat operations. We, in intentions, regard this combination of factors as potentially dangerous. "Looks kind of hazy to me," an admiral said around his pipe. "How are we supposed to persuade somebody that this means anything?" A good question, sir. Any of these indicators taken in isolation would appear entirely logical in and of itself. What concerns us is why they are all happening at once. The problem of manpower utilization in the Soviet military has been around for generations. The problem of training norms and integrity in their officer corps is not exactly new either. What caught my interest was the battery thing. We are seeing the beginnings of what could become a major disruption within the Soviet economy. The Russians plan everything centrally in their economy and on a political basis as well. The main factory that makes batteries is operating 3 shifts instead of the usual 2, so production is up. But supply in the civilian economy is down. In any case, Admiral, you're correct. Individually, these things mean nothing at all. It's only when taken in combination that we see anything to be concerned about. "But you're concerned," Sinklant said. "Yes, sir." "Me too, son. What else are you doing about it?" "We have an inquiry into SACEUR to notify us of anything they think is unusual in the current activities of the group of Soviet forces in Germany. The Norwegians have increased their surveillance in the Barents Sea. We're starting to get more access to satellite photography of ports and fleet bases. DIA has been informed of our data and is running its own investigation. More bits and pieces are beginning to show up." "What about CIA?" "DIA is handling that for us through their headquarters at Arlington Hall." "When do their spring maneuvers begin?" Sinklant asked. "Sir, the annual Warsaw Pact spring exercise, they're calling it Progress this year, is scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. There are indications that in keeping with the spirit of détente, the Soviets will invite NATO military representatives to keep an eye on things, and Western news crews as well." "I'll tell you what's scary about this," Commander, Naval Surface Forces, Atlantic, grunted. "All of a sudden, they've started doing what we've always asked them to do." "Try selling that to the papers," Commander, Naval Forces Atlantic, suggested. "Recommendations?" Sinklant asked his operations officer. We're already running a pretty active training schedule ourselves. I don't suppose it would hurt to beef that up. Toland, you said that what tipped you to this situation was this battery thing in the civilian economy. Are you looking for other economic disruptions? Yes, sir, we are. That's DIA's brief, and my contact in Arlington Hall is also asking CIA to run some additional checks. If I might amplify on this point, gentlemen, the Soviet economy is centrally managed, as I said earlier. Those industrial plans they have are fairly rigid. They don't deviate from them lightly, since those deviations tend to have a ripple effect throughout the economy as a whole. Disruption may be too strong a word at present. You just have a nasty suspicion, Sinkland said. Fine, Toland. That's what we pay you for. Good brief. Bob took his cue and left. The admirals stayed put to talk things over. It was a relief to leave. Much as he liked the attention, being examined by senior officials like a tissue culture on a petri dish could make you old rather quickly. He walked through a covered walkway back to his building and watched the late arrivals wander about looking for parking places. The grass was greening up. A civilian crew was mowing while another was fertilizing. The shrubbery was already beginning to grow, and he hoped they'd let the bushes expand a bit before they trimmed them back again. Norfolk could be pleasant in the spring, he knew, with the fragrance of azaleas on the salt-laden air. He wondered how pleasant it would be in summer. How'd it go? Chuck asked. Toland stripped off his jacket and allowed his knees to sag theatrically in front of the Marine. Pretty well. Nobody snapped my head off. Didn't want to worry you before, but there's people in there been known to do that. They say Sinklant likes nothing better for breakfast than fried commander garnished with diced lieutenant. Big surprise. He's an admiral, isn't he? I've done briefs before, Chuck. All Marines thought all sailors were wimps, Toland reminded himself. No sense giving Chuck more encouragement for that view. Any conclusions? Sinklant Ops talked about increasing training schedules. I got excused right after that. Good. We ought to have a packet of satellite shots later today. There are some questions coming in from Langley and Arlington. Nothing firm yet, but I think they might be stumbling onto some odd data. If it turns out you're right, Bob, well, you know how it works. Sure. Somebody closer to DC will make the discovery. Shit, I don't care about that, Chuck. I want to be wrong. I want this whole friggin' thing to blow over. Then I can go home and play in my garden. Well, maybe I got some good news for you. We got our TV tied into a new satellite receiver. I talked the communications guys into letting us tap into Russian television to catch their evening news. We won't learn anything hard, but it's a good way of catching moods. Just tried it out before you got here, and found out Ivan's running a film festival for all of Sergei Eisenstein's classics. Tonight, the battleship Potemkin, followed by all the others, and ending on May 30th with Alexander Nevsky. Oh, I have Nevsky on tape. Yeah? Well, they took the original negatives, flew them to EMI in London to make digitalized masters, and re-recorded the original Prokofiev score on a Dolby format. We'll be making tapes. Your machine VHS or Beta? VHS. Toland laughed. Well, maybe this job has a few bennies after all. So, what new stuff do we have? Lowe handed him a 6-inch file of documents. Time to get back to work. Toland settled in his chair and began sorting through the papers. Kiev, the Ukraine. Things are looking better, comrade, Alexeyev reported. Discipline in the officer corps has improved immeasurably. The exercise with 261st Guards went very well this morning. And 173rd Guards? Sync Southwest asked. They too need further work, but they should be ready in time, Alexeyev said confidently. The officers are acting like officers. Now we need to get the privates to act like soldiers. We'll see when progress begins. We must have our officers turn away from the usual set-piece choreography and seek realistic engagement scenarios. We can use progress to identify leaders who cannot adapt to a real combat environment and replace them with younger men who can. He sat down opposite his commander's desk. Alexeyev calculated that he was exactly 1 month behind in his sleep. You look weary, Pasha, Sync Southwest observed. No, Comrade Colonel, I haven't had the time, Alexeyev chuckled. But if I make one more helicopter trip, I think I shall sprout wings. Pasha, I want you to go home and not return for 24 hours. If you were a horse, the general observed, you would have broken down by now. This is an order from your commander-in-chief. 24 hours of rest. I would prefer it that you spend it all sleeping, but that is your affair. Think, Pavel Leonidovich. Were we now engaged in combat operations, you would be better rested. Regulations require it. A harsh lesson from our last war with Gulf. You will be clear of eye and straight of back. Alexeyev stood. His boss was a gruff old bear, so much like his own father had been, and a soldier's soldier.